So imagine all of them with Michael leading, leading the songs, But Jermaine's a very good leader too. Jermaine, it's kind of hard to tell which one's the better singer, but I think Jermaine may be just a little bit better ballad singer than.
There is a moment that Michael Jackson fans still cannot watch without feeling their chest tighten. A live television interview. A grown man, sitting across from the biggest star on the planet's own father, expecting maybe an apology, maybe some warmth, maybe just honesty. Instead, what came out of Joe Jackson's mouth in front of millions of viewers felt like a slap disguised as an answer. And in that single moment, the whole world got a glimpse of something Michael had been carrying quietly for decades. This is the story of how Michael Jackson, the most celebrated entertainer of his generation, was humiliated by his own father on live television. Not once, but in ways that repeated themselves across interviews, decades, and headlines. And to understand why that moment cut so deep, we have to go all the way back to where it started, long before the fame, long before the Grammys, long before the moonwalk changed music forever. Picture the scene. A sit-down interview, cameras rolling, the kind of conversation meant to celebrate a legendary family and their impossible rise from a small industrial town to the top of the music industry. The host asks a simple, almost harmless question about talent, about who was the true star of the group. And instead of praising the son who had gone on to redefine an entire industry, instead of acknowledging that Michael had carried the family name further than anyone could have imagined, Joe Jackson hesitated. Then he compared him, openly, on camera, to his brother. As if greatness needed to be measured, ranked, and rationed out, even after Michael had already proven himself to the entire planet. For most fathers, that would be an easy moment. Brag about your son. Let him have this one. But Joe could not seem to do it, not fully, not without pulling focus back toward himself or toward another child. And viewers watching at home saw it happen in real time. They saw Michael's most basic achievement, being recognized as extraordinary by his own father, treated as something debatable, something up for discussion, right there on live television. That is where the humiliation lives. Not in a scandal. Not in a single explosive headline. In something quieter and somehow more painful, a father who, even with the whole world already convinced, still could not simply say the words his son needed to hear. Because before Michael Jackson became a legend, he was just a little boy in Gary, Indiana, trying to get his own father to notice him. The Jackson household was not like other households. Music was not a hobby there. It was survival. It was the plan. Joe Jackson had decided, long before his sons understood what stardom even meant, that his boys were going to make it out of Gary through their voices and their feet. And in that plan, there was already a favorite. Before Michael ever sang a note in front of his father, Joe had already chosen who would lead the group. It was not Michael. It was Jermaine. The story goes that Michael's mother, Catherine, was the one who first noticed something different in her youngest son's voice. She caught him singing while he made his bed, and she went to Joe and told him this boy could really sing. Joe brushed it off. He had already made up his mind. Jermaine was the lead singer, and that decision was final. It took Catherine pushing, insisting, refusing to let it go, before Joe finally agreed to listen to Michael for himself. Only then, after his mother forced the moment into existence, did Michael get his chance. And once Joe heard him, the decision changed instantly. From that day forward, Michael was the voice out front. But think about what that meant for a small child. Before he ever stepped on a real stage, Michael Jackson had already learned that his own father's approval was not something freely given. It was something he had to earn, prove, and fight for, even inside his own home. That lesson never really left him. Think about how strange that is for a moment. This was not a story about a father discovering his son's talent and celebrating it immediately. This was a story about a father who had already made up his mind, who had already decided the hierarchy of his own children before he had even properly listened to all of them. Michael, the boy who would eventually become the single most famous entertainer the world has ever produced, almost never got the chance to lead in the first place. It took his mother's persistence to even create the opportunity. Without Catherine stepping in, without her refusing to let Joe's assumption stand, the entire trajectory of music history might have looked completely different. That is worth sitting with. The greatest performer of his generation almost never got his shot, not because he lacked talent, but because his own father was not paying close enough attention to notice it. And it only got heavier once the rehearsals began. To the outside world, the Jackson 5 looked like the ultimate feel-good story. 5 brothers from a working-class family in Indiana, singing and dancing their way into the record books. Bright lights, matching suits, dazzling harmonies. But behind the curtain of that image was something far darker, something Michael would spend years trying to describe without breaking down completely. According to Michael's own accounts later in life, rehearsals in the Jackson household were built on fear. Joe would sit in a chair, watching his sons practice their steps over and over, and he would not just correct mistakes. He would punish them. Michael described his father holding a belt while the boys rehearsed, ready to use it the moment someone missed a step or sang the wrong note. And because Michael was singled out as the group's lead voice, he became the standard everyone else was measured against, which meant he was also the one who felt the harshest consequences when something went wrong. Imagine being a child, still learning how the world works, and being told that your father's love and your father's punishment were tied to how perfectly you performed. Imagine growing up believing that a missed dance step was not just a mistake, but a reason to be afraid of the person who was supposed to protect you. That was Michael's normal. In later interviews, Michael did not just hint at this. He described it in painful detail. He talked about his father sitting there during rehearsals, belt in hand, and the constant tension that came from never knowing if this would be the day he made a mistake. He talked about how nervous he felt, not because the choreography was hard, but because failure had a physical cost. And when journalists pressed him further, asking exactly how often the discipline crossed into something more violent, Michael's answers became even harder to hear. He said the punishment was frequent, more than occasional, more than the average strict household. He said it was not limited to a belt. Other objects were used too, whatever happened to be within reach. He described being thrown against walls. He described running, being fast enough sometimes to avoid his father's grip, but not always fast enough. He remembered his own mother screaming for Joe to stop, terrified that her husband's anger had gone too far, worried that her son might actually be seriously hurt. That is not a memory of strict parenting. That is a memory of a child who genuinely feared for his safety inside his own home. And here is the part that makes it even more devastating. Even decades later, when Michael was one of the most famous human beings alive, when he had sold more records than almost anyone in history, talking about his father still made him visibly uncomfortable. In one particular interview, when asked directly whether Joe had been too strict with him, Michael hesitated. He laughed nervously, almost like a reflex, and joked that his father would be upset with him for even answering the question honestly. That reaction says more than any direct statement could. A grown man, decades removed from his childhood, one of the wealthiest and most powerful entertainers on the planet, was still bracing himself at the mere idea of his father's disapproval. Fame did not erase that fear. Success did not undo it. It simply buried it under lights, awards, and a public smile. There is something almost unbearable about that image if you really sit with it. Picture a man who has stood in front of stadiums packed with tens of thousands of screaming fans, a man who has met presidents and royalty, a man whose face was recognized in nearly every corner of the globe. And yet, the mention of his own father's name could still make his voice change, could still make him laugh, that nervous, protective laugh people use when they are trying to make a painful subject feel lighter than it actually is. Money could not buy his way out of that fear. Fame could not shield him from it. It simply followed him, quietly, everywhere he went, hidden just beneath the surface of every interview, every performance, every award acceptance speech. That is the part fans rarely talk about when they discuss Michael Jackson's eccentricities later in life. They talk about the plastic surgery, the changing appearance, the unusual habits, without ever asking the deeper question. What does it do to a person to grow up genuinely afraid of the man who was supposed to protect them, and then to spend the rest of their life performing happiness for an audience of millions while that fear never fully goes away? But Michael was not the only Jackson sibling willing to speak about what happened inside that house. LaToya Jackson, Michael's sister, gave interviews and wrote about the family's private reality in ways that lined up disturbingly well with what Michael had already described. She talked about a strict household where physical punishment was common, where belts and other objects were used, and where even her brothers, once they were grown men with their own success, were still afraid of their father. She described adult siblings, men with careers and families of their own, who still could not shake the fear Joe had instilled in them as children. What made LaToya's account even more painful was her claim that this did not stop once the Jackson 5 became famous. According to her, the abuse continued well into the years when Michael was recording some of his most successful albums. While the world saw him accepting trophies and smiling for cameras, she suggested that behind closed doors, the fear and the punishment had not gone anywhere. The public saw triumph. The family, she implied, saw something much more complicated. She also pointed out that Michael, more than his siblings, tried to push back against what was happening. She described him as the one child who would eventually try to fight, to resist, even if he did not fully understand what he was doing at the time. But instead of that resistance being met with reflection or change, LaToya said the family's overall response was denial. Nobody wanted to fully admit what had happened, which meant Michael's pain stayed buried under the family's polished public image. What makes LaToya's testimony especially hard to dismiss is the pattern it reveals. This was not a single child exaggerating a single bad memory. This was multiple siblings, independently, across different interviews and different decades, describing strikingly similar experiences. When one person tells a difficult story, people can question it, doubt it, wonder if memory has distorted the details over time. But when several people who grew up in the same house, who sat at the same dinner table, who rehearsed under the same roof, described the same fear, the same belt, the same feeling of walking on eggshells, it becomes much harder to write off as exaggeration. Not every sibling agreed with that framing, though. And this is where the family story becomes genuinely complicated, and honestly, where a lot of the controversy still lives today. Tito Jackson, another of Michael's brothers, offered a very different perspective in interviews about their father. Rather than condemning Joe's parenting, Tito defended it. He described their father as strict, yes, but insisted that strictness had a purpose. He credited Joe with pushing the family toward the success they eventually achieved, and he went as far as calling Joe one of the greatest men he had ever known, someone other fathers could learn from. On the surface, that sounds like loyalty. It sounds like a son standing up for his father. But listen closer, and something more uncomfortable starts to show through. Even while defending Joe, Tito admitted that Michael never really got to experience a normal childhood. He explained that Michael's deep love for children later in life came directly from not wanting kids to experience the kind of strict discipline and fear that he had grown up with. Read that carefully. Even the sibling defending their father was, without fully realizing it, confirming exactly what Michael had been saying all along. Whatever Joe's intentions were, whatever the results looked like on stage, something was taken from Michael in that process. A basic, ordinary childhood, the kind most people never think twice about, was something Michael never got to have. And that single fact explains so much about who Michael Jackson became as an adult. It explains why Neverland Ranch existed. It explains the amusement rides, the animals, the toys, the endless fascination with childhood wonder that so many people on the outside found strange or even suspicious. To Michael, none of that was random. It was an attempt to reconstruct something that had been stolen from him before he was old enough to understand it was happening. He surrounded himself with the innocence, the play, and the joy that his own upbringing had denied him. People judged the surface without ever asking what was underneath it. Even Joe himself, in later years, seemed to sense that Michael's love for children came from somewhere specific. In interviews, Joe suggested that Michael might have inherited that caring, protective nature from him. But for anyone who understood the full picture, that claim landed very differently. Michael's kindness toward children was not inherited warmth passed down from his father. It was closer to the opposite. It was Michael trying to give other kids the thing he never received himself. Which brings us back to where this story truly becomes uncomfortable. The live television moments. After Michael's death, Joe Jackson gave a series of interviews where he was directly confronted about the accusations that had followed him for years, the claims that he had physically and emotionally harmed his most famous son. And rather than showing any regret, rather than acknowledging even a fraction of what Michael, LaToya, and others had described, Joe denied it outright. He insisted he had simply raised his children the way any responsible parent would. He rejected the idea that he had ever caused Michael harm. This is the part that stings the most for fans who grew up watching Michael. Michael had already spoken publicly, tearfully, about being beaten as a child. He had described the fear, the belt, the panic during rehearsals. And yet, sitting in front of a national television audience, his own father erased all of it with a simple denial. He framed decades of documented pain as nothing more than normal discipline, as if Michael's own words, spoken with visible discomfort and hesitation, simply did not count. In one especially striking interview, when pressed further and reminded that Michael himself had spoken about being harmed, Joe still did not budge. He claimed he was not sure Michael had ever said that, despite the fact that it was on public record, despite the fact that millions of people had already heard Michael describe it in his own words. In that moment, live, in front of cameras, Joe essentially told the world that his son's memory, his son's pain, and his son's own testimony did not matter. That is the humiliation this story is named for. Not a single insult. Not a single cruel sentence. But the quiet, devastating experience of watching your father dismiss your pain publicly, as though it never happened, as though you imagined it, as though the fear that shaped your entire life was simply not real. And it did not stop there. Joe went even further in some of these interviews, framing corporal punishment historically, comparing it to practices from centuries ago, arguing that many parents across the country did the same thing and were simply too afraid to admit it. To some viewers, that might have sounded like a broader defense of strict parenting in general. But to those who had heard Michael's account, to those who had heard LaToya's account, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like a man trying to normalize what his own children had described as genuine fear and genuine harm. There is a certain kind of cruelty in that pattern too, the idea that a father can spend a lifetime denying his own child's pain in public, insisting he never caused harm, while that same child had already, years earlier, described exactly what happened, in detail, with visible discomfort, in front of cameras of his own. It creates two competing versions of history. One where a father raised his children with the strict discipline that any responsible parent might use. And another where a boy grew into a man still flinching at the mention of a belt, still visibly uneasy discussing his own upbringing decades after it ended. Only one of those versions matches the fear in Michael's voice when he talked about it. By the time Michael was a global superstar, the emotional distance between him and his father had grown into something almost impossible to repair. There is a story, shared by someone who worked closely within Michael's household years later, describing a moment when Joe arrived unannounced hoping to see his son. Rather than being welcomed in immediately, the household staff had to relay a message back to Joe that Michael operated on a strict schedule and that visits, even from his own father, needed to be arranged in advance. Joe did not take that well. He reportedly responded with anger, reminding whoever was in front of him that without him, none of them would have careers at all, that he was the one who built everything from nothing. It was a reaction that revealed exactly how Joe still saw himself, as the architect of the family's success, the man who deserved unquestioned access because of what he had built decades earlier. But somewhere in that story is also the quiet, painful reality of Michael Jackson's adult life. A son who had become one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the world, who could summon anyone he wanted with a single phone call, still needed structure and distance to protect himself from his own father. That distance was not born out of nowhere. It was the direct result of everything that had come before, every rehearsal, every belt, every moment his pain was dismissed on camera. So when people ask why Michael Jackson seemed so guarded, so unusual, so difficult to fully understand, maybe the answer is not really a mystery at all. Maybe it is simply this. A little boy had to earn his own father's approval before he ever felt safe. A little boy learned that mistakes had physical consequences. A little boy grew into a man who built an entire fantasy world to reclaim the childhood he never had, only to watch his father go on television, years later, and act as though none of it ever mattered. Joe Jackson helped build one of the greatest musical careers in history. Nobody serious about the story denies that. But building a career and building a childhood are two very different things. And the tragedy at the center of Michael Jackson's life may be exactly that gap. The space between the empire his father helped create and the childhood his father took away. Michael gave the world Thriller, bad, off the wall, dangerous, some of the most influential music ever recorded. He gave audiences moments that still feel impossible to top decades later. But underneath all of it was a boy who never stopped waiting for something simpler than fame. He was waiting for his father to finally see him, not as an investment, not as a product, not as proof of his own greatness as a parent, but as a son who had already given everything and deserved to be protected in return. That moment never fully came. And that, more than any award, more than any record sale, might be the most heartbreaking part of Michael Jackson's entire story. It is worth asking why this particular story still resonates so strongly today, so many years after Michael's passing, so many years removed from the interviews and headlines that originally sparked it. Maybe it is because so many people, in ways big and small, recognize a piece of themselves in it. The child who worked incredibly hard for a parent's approval and never quite felt like they received enough of it. The adult who still tenses up at a certain tone of voice, a certain phrase, a certain memory from childhood that resurfaces without warning. Michael Jackson's story, for all its extraordinary fame and impossible wealth, is at its core a deeply human one. A story about a boy who wanted his father's love more than he wanted applause from the rest of the world, and who spent much of his life trying to fill a space that fame alone could never fill. Joe Jackson has since passed away, and with him went any real chance of a full, honest reckoning between father and son, the kind of conversation that could have offered Michael something closer to peace while he was still alive to receive it. What remains instead is a public record, interviews, documentaries, books written by siblings, each offering a different angle on the same painful history. And somewhere inside all of those competing versions is the truth, imperfect and complicated, about a family that achieved everything the world could offer and still could not offer each other the one thing that might have mattered most. Michael Jackson changed music forever. He changed the way artists move on stage, the way songs are produced, the way an entire generation understood what a global superstar could look like. But behind the sequins and the spotlight was a little boy from Gary, Indiana, who just wanted his father to be proud of him without conditions attached. That is the part of his story that never made it into the record books, and it might be the part that explains everything else. If this story affected you the way it affected us while putting it together, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into the stories behind the legends we thought we already knew.